Hello and welcome back to Building Integrity. I'm your host Josh Porter, and in this installment on Champlain Towers South, the Surfside building collapse, we're going to be talking about how this could have happened, which means we're going to discuss the ethical historicity or how and what was happening during the time that this building was built, what was the era like, the time from between it was built to current, and what was happening recently before the building collapsed. One of the things we're going to be lighting on is about ethics and construction ethics, engineering ethics, and personal ethics. And I'm not going to go into a deep philosophical study on that, but it's going to be sort of the underlying framework for this video. I had a young engineering student comment in one of my previous videos saying that he didn't think it was right that we were criticizing, or that I was criticizing, the engineer that designed the building, and that, you know, you can't hold people to different standards, which partially I agree with, which is also though why, if you watch my last video, you'll see that we used the standards and we used the codes that were in place at the time, and we found that the engineer was still deficient in his work. That's not a common thing today. Most engineers do a pretty darn good job, but in this case, we found that there was definitely some things that were missed, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this video. So let's talk about the history a little bit. In the 70s and 80s, we had very high crime rates, particularly in the Miami-Dade area. In the early 80s, we also had very high immigration rates, mostly from refugees coming in from Cuba. And so what this caused is sort of a housing market exodus in Miami around that time, the early 80s and late 70s, which in essence depressed property values. So if you were a developer, and developments, even these buildings in you know, like Champlain Towers South, yes, it was built in 80, 81, but it takes many, many, many years to develop this, draw up the drawings, and to get the land and get the permits in place and everything else. So if you're already in the middle of a development, you are incentivized as a developer, especially in an era where property values in your local area are depressed because of this exodus. You are incentivized to cut as many corners as possible, save as much money as possible, because that unit that you would have sold for 1.2 million, let's say, you're now selling for 700,000. So your profits are lower. So your goal is to try to cut as many corners as possible. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's the incentive for the developer. Now, the spirit that drove the 70s and the 80s can really sort of be summarized, in my opinion, by Ivan Boesky. Now, Ivan Boesky was guilty of insider trading, and he gave a commencement speech at UC Berkeley in 1986, where he says, and I quote, "I think greed is healthy. You can be greedy and still feel good about yourself." And if you've ever watched the 1987 movie Wall Street, the character Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas, he's quoted as saying in one of the famous scenes in that movie is, he says, "Greed is good, greed is right, greed works." And so in the era of the late 70s, early 80s, we really had this change of thought about how to run business and how to conduct our personal lives, where we moved away from profit is good, which is fine. I mean, that's literally the purpose of any business, is to generate a profit. And this was conflated with this idea that greed, which is really a moral quandary, or an ethical quandary, that greed is good. And so this sort of has flavored, and you'll see how this flavors sort of everything that happened during the development of Champlain Towers South. Now, talking about the developer, his name was Nathan Reiber. Okay, and he was an attorney and businessman in Canada before moving to the Miami area. Shortly after he left and moved to Florida, he left Canada, a warrant was actually issued for his arrest for tax evasion. So he eventually pled guilty to tax evasion in 1980, and in 1984 he was disbarred from being an attorney in Canada anymore. While he was in Canada, he and some of his business partners owned apartment buildings, and in those apartment buildings they had coin-operated laundry machines. Well, he was also, him and his partners were also alleged to have skimmed $120,000 from these coin-operated machines, and then trying to launder that money back in by creating phony construction contracts that they would then funnel this money through. And of course, this was all an allegation at the time, so that hasn't been substantiated, as far as I'm aware, in any sort of conviction. But he was also caught up in a 1970s luxury boat sale scheme, and he beat that. But the appeals judge stated that these luxury boat sale transactions were professionally and ethically bereft. So this sort of kind of is fitting with the time. Greed is good. Do whatever it takes to make a buck. And this sort of, I think, is the backdrop behind the developer who developed Champlain Towers South, North, and East. What's interesting is when you build a building or develop a property, the developer is going to sometimes want to save money. We call it cutting corners, but they want to save money. So they're always pressuring the contractor to say, hey, can we use a cheaper material here? Or can we do something different here? I want to maximize my profits by reducing my costs. And usually you have this safeguard system whereby the general contractor will push back against you and say, listen, we can do this, but we can't do that. That's going to make things too unsafe. Well, that's a natural sort of organic checks and balances system. If you've ever studied government, right, we have the 3 branches of government. It creates a checks and balances system. Well, in this case, in order to circumvent that, the developer, Nathan Rybar, was actually the contractor as well. The contractor was 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙢𝙥𝙡𝙖𝙀 Construction, which was dissolved in 1999 after the 3 buildings were built. But the president of 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙢𝙥𝙡𝙖𝙀 Construction was Nathan Rybar. So it's the same person, it's his company. And so essentially you don't have then that checks and balances system. If the developer wants to cut a corner, he's also the general contractor. So he can just cut whatever corner he wants, as long as he can get it by the building inspectors, which we'll talk about as well. All right, so getting to that and talking first about Surfside Town in general and Surfside Town Council circa 1980, around the time when Champlain Towers South was built. There's a bit of a list here I'll go through. I'm going to be reading here. The developer was caught giving money to all the people running, well, actually 2, he was caught, but he claims he gave money to all the people running for Surfside Town Council. When he was caught giving campaign funds to the council members, he asked that that money be given back to him, right? So sort of a bit of trying to save face there a little bit. Now you got to understand that at that time, Surfside council members were essentially volunteers. They only made $1 per year for their service. So the question you have to ask is, well, why in the heck would you even run? You had to run and be voted in. Why would you run to sit on city council for the town of Surfside at that time if it's basically a volunteer position, if you only get $1 per year? And I think this sort of, again, adds to this backdrop where you can see how council members, why in the heck would you give so much of your time? Why would you deal with the grief of the public? Why would you deal with this if there wasn't some way to make a buck at the end of the day? So I think this sort of, that doesn't mean necessarily every volunteer of every organization is out there just to line their pockets, but you can see how when you are the board, the panel, the council, which decides whether a development happens or not, or a road gets paved or not, or you're basically this deciding factor, you can see how this may incentivize some council members to play ball and wheel and deal with some of these developers on the back end. Now, the council's job, you have to remember, is not to protect the interest of the developers, but the public. But around 1980, one of the council members was quoted, and this is around this situation where they were caught receiving money from the developer. They were quoted as saying, okay, and I quote, this council member is quoting and is talking to the news reporter in 1980, and he says, I quote, "All they," meaning the developer, "all they expect is somebody really and truly honest that will protect their interest here," meaning Surfside. Now, the job of a council member is to protect the public's interest. They're representing the town. Their job is not to protect the protected interest of the developer. That's not their job. So you can see just even that council member doesn't really get what his job is, and is quoted by the newspaper at the time as basically saying, hey, I'm here to protect the developer. The developer said that the reason they gave money to the council members was to, and I quote, "promote the constitutional right of everyone to run for office." So you know, there's a lot of ways in which you can promote the right of everyone to run for office. But when you're a developer and you are sending money and putting money in the pockets of every single council member, whether they win, lose, currently sitting incumbent or not, you can clearly see where the incentive would be. It's not a patriotic idea to promote the constitutional right of everyone to run for office. It's about currying favor. The council the same council also later approved the penthouse edition, which did violate Surfside's 12-story limit rule or law. And this caused the residents to actually try and recall the council members at the time. And if I recall, the building official and the zoning official were adamantly against it. They're like, no, that's a penthouse on top of a 12-story building is a 13th story. I mean, it's a pretty obvious cut and clear thing. The problem is, and what the city council came back and said, is that the reason why they approved the penthouse was essentially because the developer had bullied them. He had brought lawyers to the city council hearing meeting and threatened to sue the town of Surfside if they didn't grant him the ability to build these penthouses on top of the buildings. Now, the Sun Sentinel found, talking about the building department and talking about the zoning department and these other departments, the Sun Sentinel paper found around the era of the 70s and 80s that there was a couple Miami-Dade grand jury reports that were issued. And in one, they state that, quote, poor or non-existent building inspections, end quote, were responsible for, quote, poorly constructed buildings being sold to the unsuspecting public. Now, I just read that to you as it was written in the Sun Sentinel. The 1975 grand jury report cited corrupt practices and undue influences. Now, this is 5 years before construction started at Champlain Towers South. Corrupt practices and undue influences amidst the building departments. By 1992, so fast forwarding through this whole era of when all three buildings were built, the grand jury found that nothing had really changed. They're quoted as saying, quote, the effectiveness of this community's building inspection process has been questionable for decades. The process has remained vulnerable to innuendos of corruption at worst and apathy at best. Despite all of this, despite the history of the town council, the nonsense that went on with the construction of the building, and the, let's just say, ethical record of the developer, when all three buildings were all done, Nathan Reiber's obituary stated that he was actually given the key to the city once all the towers were built. So this is a very strange time in the 80s and early 90s and late 70s, obviously, where a developer, you can basically come to Miami and you can reinvent yourself. You can leave your criminal past behind you and create a new criminal legacy, I guess. And so I just found that really fascinating that he was granted the key to the city once all the buildings were built. Now, when the buildings were built, they were designed. We've done a lot of videos looking at the engineer drawings that were prepared by Breiterman, Jurado, and Associates. He was the design engineer, but he was not free from controversy either around the time. In 1972, he had the engineer Breiterman, who designed Champlain Towers South and North. He was also the engineer that was supposed to inspect the construction of a 5-story public building in Coral Gables. After the building was built, it was reported to have leaked like a sieve, quote unquote, and it developed a lot of cracks in the garage. Now, according to the Miami Herald, in 1976, he overlooked a major construction defect involving this building, which resulted in insufficient steel reinforcement in the structure. Now, this is really interesting because there's a lot of concern that that in Champlain Towers South, that even though the design was deficient, which I've covered in my last video, but there's a lot of photography out there that seems to beg the question of this was this building properly reinforced even according to the deficient plans? Was enough rebar put in? Well, it's just so interesting that in 1976, he had overseen this construction of this building where it had literally half the rebar that it was supposed to have in it in certain components, particularly these parapet walls on the parking structure. Now, he was quoted as saying in defense of himself, he stated that the components of the building missing the rebar were not, and I quote, basic parts of the structure like slabs and beams. Now, what this tells me is that he had a fundamental lack of understanding about what load bearing means. And that's so critical as an engineer. If you don't understand what components are load bearing and what components aren't load bearing, all components that are load bearing are structural. So to say, well, this part of the structure that was lacking the rebar really wasn't that important because it's not a slab or a beam, he doesn't understand his own job or his own profession. The parts that were missing the rebar were the parapet walls around the parking structure, which means if the walls are too weak and somebody accidentally hits their gas a little too much in the parking structure, they could go through that wall and off the end, presumably to their death. So it's a very important part of the structure. Anyway, after that, he went on 3 years later in 1979 to design Champlain Towers South and Champlain Towers North. And in the construction of these buildings, okay, particularly, right, we're talking about Champlain Towers South, the building that actually collapsed, he actually provided as-built structural certification for that construction as well, certifying that it's been built according to the plans, all the rebars here, everything's fine, nothing to see. Now, over the course of time, from the early 80s when the building was built up until today, what has happened is a lot of people will sell units, and seasonal rentals and yearly rentals have become a really big business. So many of the units in in Champlain Towers South have actually been sold to investors who own 2, 3, 4, or 5 units apiece. And these investors historically do not like spending money on anything in the building because it all cuts into their profits. All they're looking to do is keep renting the unit out, keep renting the unit out. Hey, it's a beachfront condo. You can rent it for $3,000 a week or whatever they're making. And they just want to keep renting it. They don't want to have to turn around and cut a check for $200,000. That would lose like 2 years of profit income for them. And so that's different than a homeowner who views their home as a long-term investment. The property investors really look at this thing as a short-term moneymaker. And so that sort of creates conflict within the condo board when you get this report, which we're coming up to now in the recent history of 2018, 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙢𝙥𝙡𝙖𝙀𝙗𝙀 and Associates, which is the engineer that provided the 40-year recertification study report. When they provide this report, you can see that you're going to have a lot of internal opposition inside amongst the unit owners from these investors that don't want to spend a dime. And they will threaten to use lawyers and whatever else to kind of slow down and stop this process. I'm not saying that happened for Champlain Towers South. I'm just saying I have seen this happen several times before. All right. So 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙢𝙥𝙡𝙖𝙀 and Associates writes their 40-year recertification study, and they found design and construction defects. Which we all know. So I'm just going to kind of recap things we already know about this report that they provided. They warned of exponential worsening of the structure over time. But what's really interesting is that they did not call for an evacuation or temporary shoring. Now, I haven't brought this up, but this has been on my mind since day one. And I don't want anybody to walk away from this video thinking that I am accusing 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙢𝙥𝙡𝙖 and Associates of deficiencies anywhere, okay? I do find it alarming, based on what I have seen of the building, that there wasn't some sort of temporary shoring called out, or the building was called for an evacuation. But I don't know, sitting here right now, everything that 𝘾𝙗𝙖𝙢𝙥𝙡𝙖 and Associates knew. Okay, and so we all have to kind of save our judgment on should they have done more, should they have said more, should they have closed the building down, should they have called for temporary shoring in the garage. We have to save that judgment until we know more. And what the things that you need to know is, for example, like their report contains 20-something photos, right, or something like that. But the reality is I've done these studies, so many of these studies, and you come back to the office with hundreds of photos, right? I mean, Digital photography is free now. You don't have to take it down and have it developed, have your film developed. So there's no need to conserve film per se. You just take hundreds and hundreds of photos of everything. You take videos of things, water's dripping out of things. I know plenty of engineers, we would turn on the video portion of our camera and we would record the video dripping. So there's a lot of photography that we don't have access to, a lot of records, historical records that we don't have access to. What was the other structural repairs that were done, close-up photography, the quality of the image that we have available to us in Morabito's report is actually very low. I mean, it's a scanned in. First off, the photos are reduced down to very small size to be put into the report, and then the report is scanned in, and then we have that scanned version, right? So we need to save judgment until we receive all that. Now, I can tell you that there are parties. I would be shocked if Morabito hasn't been sued by somebody yet, right? Because the idea isn't that that just automatically means they're guilty of anything, but everybody gets sued when in a situation like this. And so as part of that lawsuit, they're going to be subpoenaed and they're going to have to produce all of their written records, all of their emails, all their text messages related to the Champlain Towers South. And they're going to have to produce all of their videos and photography. Now, whoever that engineer expert is that's working for that attorney, when he reviews all of that stuff, he or she may actually reach a conclusion stating that the engineer should or should not have called for extra work or temporary shoring or something like that. But at this point, we can't make that judgment yet. We can just simply state that it's odd. All right. After Morabito and Associates produces this report, Ross Prieto, who is the former building official for Surfside, I believe in 2018, was asked by the board, the condo board, to come and speak at their board meeting. And the meeting minutes have him quoted as telling the residents at Champlain Towers South, even after reading the report, the damning report from Morabito and Associates, that their building appears to be in, I quote, in very good shape. And so you can think, you got to put your mind in the mindset of a resident in the building or a board member. If you have the town's building official standing in front of you, telling you your building's in very good shape, the temperature in the room comes way down and you're like, oh, okay, man, maybe we don't need to worry so much about this building. It's not such a big deal. I'm not so terrified. Let's call Morabito in a year and see, maybe we'll put something together eventually, right? You bring the temperature down and a temperature, which in my opinion was appropriately raised to a certain extent by Morabito's report. And then you've got the town officials saying, everything's fine. The building appears to be in very good shape. This is very problematic, and I believe the town is being sued for this advice that was given, and I think they're looking for Mr. Prieto or something. I can't remember what where the currently situation is with him and his presence. So here's a couple things that come to my mind. Why in the heck would the building official even show up to meet with a condo board? I've never seen that, to be honest with you. And then what are the motivations for saying, even after reading Morabito's report, that their building is in very good shape? Well, there's three things that come to mind. Either it's incorrect, that's a lie, and he never said that, okay? And the meeting minutes are just wrong. Now, we know we're pretty confident that the meeting minutes weren't forged, okay, later, like in 2021, but somebody could have gotten it wrong, right? And I'm sure that's the argument that Mr. Prieto is going to make. He's going to say, I never said that. And so then it becomes difficult because it becomes a he said, she said. You're going to need more people that were present at that meeting, survivors that were present at that board meeting, to say, oh no, I heard him say that the building's in very good shape, right? So you're going to need eyewitness testimony to that. So one, it's either a lie, he never said it, or two, the building official is grossly incompetent, which means he doesn't know anything about what he's doing, doesn't know anything about construction, doesn't know anything about engineering, doesn't know anything about his job, read the Morabito report, doesn't know half the words that are in it, and he's just incompetent. So it could be that the meeting minutes are a lie, or it could be that he's grossly incompetent, or the third possibility, these are all just possibilities, I'm not saying that these are facts, but the third possibility would be that the building official may have received pressure. And remember the history of Surfside and everything that's gone on for the decades leading up to this collapse. He could have received pressure from investors and residents to not harm their property values. Okay, now this is really important that you understand this, because whenever you go to sell a unit, you have to disclose if there's a special assessment or if there's a problem with the building. You have to disclose this. So for example, if you're about to face a $200,000 special assessment and you're trying to sell a $700,000 condo unit, the potential buyer of that $700,000 condo unit is only going to want to spend $500,000 because he's going to have to write the check for the special assessment that's coming up. But if you can get somebody like a building official to come forward and say, hey, don't worry about it, your building's in very good shape, then you actually don't have to disclose. It doesn't matter that you have Morbido's report, because now you have somebody else that's official. We call this opinion shopping. You have somebody else that's official that has said it's very good shape. You are not obligated now to disclose the condition of the building to potential buyers. Therefore, also maintaining the property values. Because think about it. If you disclose that there's a special assessment coming by, and I just explained that that $700,000 unit, if you have a $200,000, let's say, special assessment coming up, you would realistically only be able to sell the unit for $500,000. Well, that means the unit is now valued at $500,000. So the goal would be for these investors is to maintain their cap rate on their rentals and to maintain those property values. That would be a very strong motivating factor. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people want to talk to Mr. Prieto to ask him why. Why did he say this? Did he say it, and why did he say it, right? Okay, so with everything that we've talked about, with all the history that we've gone through with the Champlain Towers South, how it was built, the interesting characters who built it, their lack of really understanding of construction or engineering. I think when we're talking about my last video where we talked about design to fail, that there was so many design deficiencies, and then we talk about things that we've sort of been alluding to in other videos about how it was built deficiently. I think when you sort of look at the ethical standing of the parties that were involved in the construction, engineering, oversight, and decision-making over the years of this building, it's not too difficult to understand now how this event may have happened. Well, if you enjoyed this video, please let us know. Thanks for watching.